It's time to be open, to unlock, unlimit, and unleash data. It's time to work together. Above all else, it's time to simplify. One place for all your data. One foundation for every workload, from BI to AI. One platform that runs where you run. One architecture that puts an end to the trade-offs and brings it all together. One Lakehouse.
Okay, welcome everyone to session 12.5. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to say if you have questions and you're in the room, I'll pass you the mic so it can get recorded. If you're not in the room, and I think there's 91 attending virtually, you can type your questions into the Whova platform and I'll be reading those and we'll present those to John. So without further ado, John Lynch from Databricks. Take it away.
Thank you, Wayne. Before I get started, I think I introduced myself to as many as I could here. My name is John Lynch. I'm a field CTO for Databricks, and I've been at Databricks for about 4 years, but data my entire career, and early Spark contributor and a part of the Spark community. What I do at Databricks, though, is mostly help folks like yourselves on the journey to modernization in the cloud, sometimes optimization and things like that. Notably, and I'm going to talk about this. The company I represent is Databricks, and to give you just a few highlights about Databricks before we go, we were the original creators of Apache Spark, the founding team. So we set out to the team set out to create a platform to unify analytics, and what that really meant is to help them to compete in a new world against some of these FANG companies that I'm going to talk about, bringing analytics to the forefront in a different way than was historically done. From Spark, the next project we created was we created two major ones after that. One of them was Delta Lake, and Delta Lake is one of the foundations for the house part of the lake that I'm going to talk about. It's going to be a more general talk, less about Databricks after this slide, but I want to give you a little bit of background. And then the other project that we created was MLflow. That's about putting guardrails on the data science process from experimentation to production. And all these tools need to work together, and I'm going to talk about why and how in a minute. Companies raised about $3 billion in investments. We have about 4,000 employees, and you can see we have north of 7,000 customers now. So you see these FANG companies, data and analytics was foundational to them. They started, and they were disrupting. They started from the beginning disrupting markets. Tesla, the automotive market, completely disrupted by Tesla. And you can think about AWS isn't up there, but you can think about what they've done to some of our customers that work with us is in terms of how they needed to think about how they did things with their data and what they needed to do going forward. So it's disrupting a lot of the markets, a lot of the verticals that we work with. And there's next generation companies that are emerging because of this. They're emerging a different way, and they're starting out the way that these FANG companies did. So analytics is an option for them. They think about analytics in the core. Rivian's one of our customers. They started at the base. Everything they do is model driven. They make decisions that way. They're, again, disrupting the automotive market. So when I talk about this disruption, and I relate to customers, we relate to customers like yourselves, we think about this maturity curve, and we think about this for a lot of different things. We think about how we relate to customers, where they're at in this maturity curve. We think about where they want to be. We align to them on their goals, and we help them think about their organization differently too. This isn't just about technology. This is about understanding what they're trying to do, what they're trying to do organizationally, and how they're trying to get. And sometimes customers come to us and they're pretty far to the right in some places. Like they're like, well, we're running some modeling to make some serious decisions. If you think about what Geico is doing with telematics with their cars, right? They're pretty far to the right on some use cases, but they want to unify it all. So we sometimes are starting from the left and helping them modernize off of existing platforms like legacy Teradata and Netezza, Hadoop, all those things, right? or I'm sorry, the left, I meant to say the left, starting from the left and helping to move to the cloud there. But sometimes they've been in the cloud and they're trying to modernize to their whole data estate, and they're thinking about their organization differently. They're thinking about the way that their platform should be differently. They're having to acquire data differently. There's a lot of different things that are happening now to to your organizations like yourselves that are making people think about how they actually mature. And some examples of companies that we think have actually adopted, and some examples of they adopted. You think a company like Goldman Sachs, the way they partner with Apple and the Apple Card. They knew when they started the partnership they had to do it different. They needed to be able to approve a loan from the phone very quickly. Riot Games they're filtering content in real time in their games. They're making in-game decisions for what products they try to upsell. And one that's near and dear to my heart is Walmart and Sam's Club. Was the very first day at Databricks, I met with Sam's Club, and they were like, we're just trying to get our data science going. We're working on our laptops. We don't know what to do. Now they've went all the way to the point where they have 5,000 users using, in this case, Databricks in a Lakehouse, I'm going to talk about, and they're driving significant modeling to make decisions about fresh food that they make in their store. So things have changed. Some companies are on this path, some want to be there, and we talk about that maturity curve. A lot of companies just want to accelerate, and that's what we're going to talk today about, is some of the things to think about as you're accelerating. So the point is that most customers are still struggling. Most of the time they're just struggling unifying data. Forget about analytics and AI. They have a hard time. They're trying to modernize their data platforms for cost and efficiency. They're trying to move as quickly as fast as possible as they can to the right to actually make the decisions and remain competitive based off those disruptors that we talked about. So this is just a repeating, like what we saw before, but the real leaders are to the right, and where they're saying they're actually those disruptors are actually using data to drive decisions. And if every leader I talk to, it wants to be model driven. It's an aspiration in some way to be model driven and actually use models to reduce something, in the case of, I can go through customer after customer of how they think about what they want to do differently, and also accelerating through this curve. So one of the things that we've realized, and while I'm going to talk generally about Lakehouse here now, is that in most cases, companies are still using two different platforms for data management. They're using one platform for BI that talks to their business, that helps the business make decisions. What happened? It's a lot of reactive. What happened? What should we? And a lot of times they're days, if not weeks, behind in terms of the decisions that they're making based off of that. And then they have another platform that's more science-y, that's their data lake, and they're trying to drive those predictions. But there's a few problems with that. These two obviously the first major problem is they're disjointed. You have data that's in one place for business, another place for exploration and data science. And the teams aren't working together organizationally. So they may not even know that they each exist. So you've got this valuable data that you could use for business and data science. If you mix them together, they don't even know they exist. They're completely disjointed. And honestly, this is operationally expensive too. The security model is another thing that we hear. Every time I go talk to a customer now, they're like, how can I govern data? How can I discover data? How am I going to actually secure it? I don't even know where it all is. And at this time, these leaders are being tasked to move and modernize quicker to like we thought, to reduce total TCO and actually drive to the right that we talked about on that slide with the innovation curve. And then finally, with having them disjointed, there's just incomplete support for the use cases they want to drive. When you want to do something that actually does a prediction for the business and the business isn't involved, how can you do it? You can't do it. And there's so much value if you take that data and locate it together. And the teams, honestly, the way the teams think about data is different. You got one team that's thinking about highly normalized data and the value of it, and you got another team that's like, I need the rawest form of data because I don't want to miss anything to make a prediction. And if I miss something to make a prediction, I want to go back on it. At the same time, there's a new personas that are emerging. So you have all the existing personas. Most companies are trying to recognize and build data science teams, right, and ML teams. But now there's business users that are doing more advanced analytics. They're doing citizen level data science. They're doing things with products like dbt where they're actually building new data models on the fly to answer questions that they wouldn't have been able to do before. And they're not going to do that in a warehouse. They're going to do that on raw data and build different data models. And when you get those two teams working together, it's a much different organization. And I'll pause for a second because I think and drive into one of the customer stories that I realized when I was actually at Data and AI Summit. We were talking about as people came in, we had a summit where we had a lot of our customers. And one of our major customers in product goods, they've actually taken it to the point where they've converged their systems, like we've talked about, but they're actually organizing their data product teams differently. There's no chance that they can get to where they're getting without intermingling these teams. The domain knowledge on the business mixed with the actual predictive power of a data science or ML team, it does drive results. They're doing neighborhood level analytics now where they decide where they're going to sell their products based on individual neighborhoods across the globe. They would have never been able to do that before if they didn't have that domain knowledge mixed in with the production power of a data science team that they have. They made all these investments, but they realized to really leverage it, they needed to think about the platform and their organization as a whole too. I'm going to make sure I'll pause. Is there any questions on this so far? Okay.
Actually, one quick question. Distinguish between different. Sorry. Do you distinguish between different types of data warehouse and the legacy structures on the left of the diagram here, or do you care star schema versus Inman versus Kimball?
Yeah. So we don't necessarily care. We don't necessarily think about it that way. We think about it from the customer's perspective. You may think of it that way. But the way that we think about this pattern, Lakehouse, is that the data should exist in a way that's powerful to empower your data practitioners, right? And if one model works, the important part is having that model accessible by all the people that actually can do work. And that's a core tenet of what I'm going to talk about. This is like leading up to the problem space, what we've seen, and then there's the idea of like, well, how do we think that customers can solve it? And one of the major things is actually locating them together, making that data discover. The model themselves that they drive, to me and to the Databricks and to the Lakehouse pattern that other companies are adopting, it's more important to be able to empower them. And what I have learned though is that sometimes people built data models for very specific use cases and old technology that couldn't handle to do aggregations at the speed that these platforms can today. So some of them, the first step is get the data together. And the second step is, hey, let's evaluate some of this. Maybe we don't need to do it the same way. But I think that stepping into it with data in the same place and governed in the same way and accessible by the practitioners that we're talking about is much more important than the second step. The second step is, okay, well, let's talk about cost now. We went one step to reduce cost and optimize. Let's talk about going another step. And maybe we don't need to do that ETL to that new model anymore because of the way that all the tooling that's emerging and also the way that other people are just like they're actually looking at other data. And one other customer that I'll talk about is Walmart here. We started with them all the way down to, we started with them years ago. And we worked up from like more complex use cases that they couldn't solve with any other platform like IoT, the refrigerators and things like that, all the way to finally the register data. And the register data was so massive that they used to have to do a model like you were talking about. They have to do some kind of level of aggregation. And then what they found is that doesn't work for the things that the financial forecasts and models that they want to do. So they're actually one of the customers that drove us to think this way. The early modern disruptor that were being disrupted, like Walmart, we're like, for us to compete, we can't do it the same way anymore. We got to collect that register data. We got to be able to do forecasting on it, sometimes within the hour, not just every 7 days. And it kind of speaks to your point is their data model changed because of that. Okay, I'm gonna build this out because it's a little bit laggy. Sorry. So this is a little bit more Databricks focused for a second. We were talking about Lakehouse, like why we think the Lakehouse pattern is important and what the problem, I'm sorry, more about the problem area. But the Lakehouse paradigm is the idea of taking a lot of those, all of those practitioners having the tooling that they expect in one place, but more importantly, putting them in a place where they can actually interact with data. And there's a lot of steps to that. I'm not going to get too much into all of the Databricks details because I think that the thing that we wanted to talk about today is more about the organizational part and more about thinking about the data. And a big part of this pattern, I'm going to go into this a little bit more, but a big part of this pattern, I think when leaders ask me is like, well, what's our first step? Our first step is, hey, you're modernizing, you have all this data, how should I curate the data? And you think about decision one that you make is, I want to curate data. I want to make it available to folks to actually drive business decisions and actually drive data products. That curation decision is a big one. And that's one of the core tenets of Lakehouse is that the data needs to be in open formats. It needs to be in storage that's accessible by more than one platform in a way that these practitioners can interact with it. So you don't want to hamstring yourself into the world that we were in before where you had a platform like, for example, I don't want to pick on Teradata, but it's a great platform, but you have to talk to Teradata a certain way. And that doesn't always work for the data problems that have emerged today. So if you curate your data in open storage, it allows for flexibility on how you interact with the data. If you need to publish that data to something that drives business for you, a highly aggregated set of data, to your point, like a data model that makes sense for a particular use case, that's okay, but publish it from a curated layer. Don't build it directly where other folks can't drive value from it. And so that's the simple open part, and we actually recommend Delta Lake for it because we built it through, Databricks has built Delta Lake as the house part of Lakehouse is for transactional guarantees, inserts, GDPR, all the things that you need to curate data with the same level of flexibility with a lot of the features like that warehouses have, primary keys and foreign keys and things like that. But that's a little bit more opinionated. The point that I want to make at that layer, on the lowest layer for Lakehouse, is that make that curation decision. And then and make that curation decision with zones too, with different, with different, I don't want to call them SLAs, but different characteristics for each zone. A lot of customers do that, use Medallion for that. They talk about raw, bronze, silver, gold, and have that curation defined, and then build off of that. But make that foundational decision first before you move past that. And that is one of the, when I talk to, like I said, I'm working mostly now in FinServ because a lot of the other verticals have started modernizing and moving. But in financial services, that's one of the biggest decisions that most of these companies are making right now. I have a lot of data. I have a lot of different access patterns. I need to curate it. And the guidance that we're giving them is do it in an open way, decide on an open format, and make it so you have flexibility. And then you won't have any of those lock-in problems that you had before. Okay, and then the second thing, as we go up, is that you need to catalog and govern the data. And you need to have a strategy for that. We're opinionated on that. We built something called Unity to do that. But with Lakehouse, you need to have the same features that a warehouse had for governance. You need to be able to control, you need things like auditing. You need to have fine-grained access control. And by the way, that layer, you need to be thinking about multi-cloud at some point, because every business that's been in the cloud for a while that's been disrupted is also operating in multiple clouds for different reasons. So those two layers are the first. I think of that curation layer, number one, and then you start thinking about how you govern and actually make it available and secure. And then finally, the top layer of the Lakehouse is I don't just need SQL access anymore. I need a data scientist to be able to use a notebook. I need a new emerging data, they're calling it SQL analysts, to be able to use tools like DBT. I need warehouse-like capabilities for reliability and BIing dashboard. And by the way, the way that data is landing in this curated zone is different than it ever has been before. Companies, and I'm going to show a story, I think, if we have time, on Walgreens. Walgreens is another company that we've been working on the curation for a long time. They started with their pharmacy data and they're like, we just want to get it batch, we want it curated. We made that decision, we're going to curate it in open formats, but now they've moved on to, since they curated the way that they have, they're able to actually start streaming the data. So now they're streaming directly into their first zone. And they were able to they made the choice to use Delta Lake. But, the nice thing about that is that when they switch to streaming, they can just point at an existing table and sync it directly into a stream. And the value is that it's flexible. So, and at the same time, all those other core tenets that we talked about, governance, openness, and simplicity are still there. And as you go further up the stack on these technologies, there might be a new persona that emerges that you need that we don't even know about. So the point is, this all needs to be open, it needs to be flexible, and it needs to be simplified. And the way that we look at it is, at Databricks, is Lakehouse is that. That's what it is. And whether you choose to use a product like Databricks, that's another decision. Those first decisions that we talked about in this new world are mandatory. And this is a big slide. Is there any questions on this? So again, I spoke to this, but to drive it home, simplicity is key because of cost. And you don't want a team managing all those transitions that we talked about. The more that you can drive on open platforms with open storage and simplify, and the more that you can serve directly off of that curated data in open formats, means less changing, it means less data movement, it means all those things. And we talked about the importance of multi-cloud. It may not be important to you today, but what I've realized is that a lot of our earliest verticals that we've worked with, like retail and even in media and entertainment, they need multi-cloud. Because they're like, I work with HBO Max and Disney streaming, right? And they're deploying worldwide. And in some places they have to deploy in different clouds. Multi-cloud isn't an option anymore. And then I talked about openness. I talked about why simplicity is so important, and I'm gonna show you that in a minute. But this drives it home based off of the layers that we talked about. You have your multi-cloud layer, you have your storage layer, the curation layer that we talked about with Delta Lake, and then the governance layer, like in our case is Unity Catalog. And then at the final is the top is the key. These are the key use cases that we need to support today. And a lot of the things that we go after with customers, use cases fit in those boxes. But I think the biggest point here is that we should be able to add one of those green boxes really easily. And maybe the customer for their business needs to add that green box. If everything's open, they can do that.
Quick question. Are you making assumptions in there, in this architecture, of what you can federate and what you cannot federate? For example, the catalog, probably not a good idea to federate, probably all in one place is a good idea. But the layers below, are you making any assumptions in there in terms of one data lake versus every business line has their data lake, but your catalog taps into all of it, or like two?
No, that's a really good question. So a lot of people talk about data mesh when they talk about that. And and this gets a little bit more Databricks. I'm trying to be a little bit more general because the kind of audience, the kind of group we're with. But with Unity Catalog, we think about data sharing for that across business lines and across. You can share data across multi-cloud and across regions in different clouds. At the catalog layer, but it just all it's doing is keeping a pointer for you and managing the permissions and also the auditing. So if somebody let's say one of the biggest banks in the world is one of the ones I'm working with right now, and they're going to do it based on business unit. They're going to have a Lakehouse per business unit, but they want to have data sharing. And they're also realizing that some of the business units might not be on the same, they may not be on the same cloud. So one may be in GCP and the other one may be in AWS. And that governance layer needs to discover it all, because you don't want to be, and this gets a little bit more deeper technical, because you got to think about egress then and all these things. But that's kind of like the next step, if you will. Sorry.
But I guess my question is, at the data lake layer and below, you're making no assumption in this architecture of having one instance. This can be completely federated, and a company can say, I have 200 business units. Each of them is going to have their own data lake. The layer above, though, the catalog, is going to have have a pointer.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. We can't make that assumption with this architecture because it wouldn't be flexible enough. Yeah, and again, some of this is actually regulatory. Sometimes you have to keep data for Europe or China in the actual region, and that's why we have this. We have, if I go back to Databricks for a second, we have customers that have hundreds of data lakes, and that's what got us here, though. So is they're like, they started early and they're like, well, now we don't know where everything is. We want we want to be able to search across all of those data lakes. And to your point, lake houses, because they're more than that, but they need auditing and they need all those things. And then also they want a simplified security model across those, right? So they want to be able to do things like, and I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about this, but they want to say, hey, I have a security policy on this one piece of data. I want it to flow all the way through. And I also want that to be way simplified. And that's, when you think about that governance layer, like I said, the curation is the first major decision, but that governance layer is really important for a lot of reasons, depending on your industry too. Like some industries are a little bit different there. But your point is 100% taken. And like I said, I work with customers who have literally, if I talk about the term lakehouse, they have 1,000 lakehouses. And then I work with really large customers with hundreds of petabytes of data, many hundreds of petabytes, that have 2. But they did it based on what made sense to their data. And they still have all these characteristics, though. Yeah. Oh, sure.
Yeah, one you can maybe cover later in one of your topics, but just curious about the implementation of this for business continuity, because obviously with traditional warehousing kind of solutions, that's a big element, right? Mission critical data, you have to make it accessible, you have to make sure it's backed up, kind of from a business continuity perspective, be able to recover and restore all that stuff. If you can maybe talk about that when you talk about
Yeah, I think if I catch you on the after, we have a whole blog post about that and that's a little bit more Databricks opinionated. But the nice thing is about when you're in the cloud, there's durability on the data already. But their clouds do have problems. They're not perfect, as you probably all have seen. So we have customers that do regional based things with their data. Like they'll do multiple region copies and those kinds of things, make sure but some customers do full multi-cloud copies. And I think it's one of those things that goes back to business goals again and what you need. But the nice thing is it's hugely simplified compared to what you have to do with things like WAN-Disco back in the day when we had to do data center to data center replication. It's something that we would work with you and discuss in more detail if you're a Databricks customer. But if you're not a Databricks customer, that's fine too. A lot of the points that we make in our blog will tell you the things that you should be thinking about. And we're always thinking about that. Remember when I showed you that maturity curve in the beginning? We want to make it to a point where a job, like if you think visionary for a second, a job doesn't fail, it can move. We can move jobs and understand where data, and have heavily replicated data. We're thinking about multi-cloud being much more than what it is today at some point. It's just the pace that we're going at on that curve as a company, if I go back to Databricks a second, is based off of customers, what they're doing and what they need now. And one thing that if we go back to Databricks, is we made that Unity catalog investment based on one of the points he made and a lot of things about just overall the problems that we've seen by having 7,000 or 8,000 customers go through all of these steps that we've been talking about. So your point is we have that documented, but I think that you and I can talk more about that and what it means and what your requirements are. That's kind of a little bit more of a requirements discussion too. Okay, so I talked about this. I was gonna drive into this just a little bit, what Unity Catalog is, but again, think about this. This is Databricks specific, but think about this as a decision. Think about, hey, I got to make a decision on how I'm going to catalog. We made a major investment here. And when you think about governance nowadays, you're not thinking about governance the same way you used to when you actually build a lakehouse. You're governing different things. You're governing warehouses, tabled columns. You can see the list. Different lakes, files, models now. All these things need to be governed and audited now. And then you also have to think about, you got a chief data officer. That job is changing. I mean, that job, now you're things like data value, you have to make decisions based off of, hey, what does it take to make this model? What are the data sets that was used to make this model? Is it worth all the compute that I spend to build this data set? What is it driving? And that's why this governance and difference of of thinking matters, because you're driving different value than you used to. You're spending money different ways than you used to. Before, it was a sunk cost, right? You would do cap cost on how you actually built a platform. It's a much more agile cost structure, and all those things matter when you're making decisions on when you want to spend money. So this governance and observability is really important here. And some of the capabilities. Data, you can't do what I just talked about without data lineage. If you don't know how the data was prepared and what it's being used for and what it's driving, you can't do it without data lineage. And I think about these capabilities, if you erase all the Databricks stuff, is stuff that you need to think about when you're thinking about this journey and this modernization story. So I don't know, I've touched on a lot of those key capabilities, but they're going to also evolve. And I have a slide about the evolution of how we've had to think about product based off of our customers. We're evolving for you, but that's another thing, is when you think about the platforms you choose, make sure you choose, because you're going to evolve. Everything's going to change, and you can see how it's just changed in the last 4 years. So this is a little bit about like how important ML isn't a choice anymore. I hope everyone feels the same way. Like it used to be like, hey, you'd hire data scientists and they would go and they may make something interesting. And leaders used to like to talk about, they had a data science team. The driving value was kind of optional. It isn't anymore. It's like front and center. And governing all that is really important. And, again, this is Databricks specific, but when you think about governing machine learning, there's certain things and tooling that you need in the platform to do that, and part of a lakehouse. And model registry, not really an option. You need a place to store models, understand how they're used, what they're used, the deployment strategy for them for ML ops and things like that. We leverage data reproducibility is hugely important, especially in regulatory. Like, how did I make this model? What were the steps? Who trained it? What were the steps they went through? If someone ever comes back and wants to question the prediction quality of a model, or in the case of a bank or a financial services industry, they need to understand that model provenance, sometimes for regulatory reasons. So thinking about that's really important. AutoML is, again, speaking of those emerging, personas that we have. You need to have tooling for them to actually be able to interact with data in a different way. And that's becoming less and less optional either. It was kind of a nice to have, but now, again, they have that domain knowledge, right? They understand, like, I need to be able to predict something at X, Y, and Z, right? I understand that for my business how to do that. If you can fast track that and give a starting point to a data scientist through AutoML, well, it reduces time and total cost. All the things start to happen based off of that. So AutoML is becoming a little bit more forefront, kind of like the DBT, if you will. If everybody doesn't know what DBT is, I said that a few times. It's a tool for simplifying data modeling that everyone's using. It's an open source tool, and if you don't, I'll point you to some docs on it. But I feel like AutoML is kind of like that for the data science community. And then finally, these users need to collaborate. If you look back to what I talked about with Sam's Club, that was what the first thing that came to us is like, we're spending a ton of money hiring these data scientists and we don't know what they're doing. They're not doing it in a centralized place, and that scared them. So collaboration and versioning and cataloging all this work that these teams do is not optional anymore. And then you need to support the tooling they expect. And this is like I said, some of that's more product specific, so I won't go into that too much. And I'll pause again to make sure there's no questions. Okay, so this is Databricks built something called Delta Live Tables, and we built this and this is, again, a lot of the features of this is what's important to chief data officers. And the reason we built it was we listened to companies like ADP, and we have a talk where the chief data officer of ADP said, I need to understand what's being built in my data factory. He's like, he was actually looking at DBT, the tool that I talked about, and we had built something called Delta Live Tables that uses the open format Delta Lake that I mentioned as the base, and it builds all this stuff around it. It makes it so you don't need to think about data dependencies. It gives you observability for free. It makes it so a data engineer can quickly build a pipeline and not think about all those things. But what happens is what bubbles up, and this is the important part, is observability. the chief data officer knows, hey, what's being built, what's the data quality of it, and how's the inbound data factory working. And this is emerging for us right now. We built this tool based off of feedback from our customers. But this is more characteristics of the things that you need to think about when you're building prescriptive pipelines and how to manage pipelines as, in more of a CI/CD fashion, being able to manage and make pipelines that build that key data for your organization more portable. It's something that a lot of companies are thinking about. Software companies like ourselves are trying to simplify it. And that's what we have. That's one of our product sets for that. But like I said, I want to make it more about what you guys should be thinking about, less about what our product is. And stop me if there's any questions. And then finally, when you're building a lakehouse and you're building this new next generation modern architecture, you need to be able to share insights with the business and not reduce data movement. And this is something that we've invested in as a company, is that last, people historically, data lakes were, like I said, they were more for, exploratory, use cases for data scientists and things like that. We had a lot of our customers like Starbucks push us here. They're like, we have all this data gravity inside of our lakehouse. We don't want to push it and publish it out to another platform. It's too expensive for us for custom ETL, different security models. The data is heavy. We don't want to push it around. Are you okay? Yeah. So we made our SQL story be part of a lakehouse, and we made it fit into our platform and made the SQL analyst a first-class citizen in our lakehouse. But I think the point here I want to make is how important it is to actually be able to give business access to data that's produced. And things like what we're working on right now, to give you an idea of intermingling teams, like I talked about, is that a data scientist is going to be able to publish a model into the registry that we talked about, a model registry, like for cataloging all the models they produce. And the business is going to be able to pick that model up directly and use it in a SQL query, all inside the same platform. And I think that if you think about what that does, that's really what the kind of things that we want to drive in a platform and a pattern like this is that level of interaction. And at the same time, going all the way back to all the observability and lineage and data value I talked about, you will know, hey, this business user is using this model. This endpoint where we're actually doing predictions for example, for Goldman Sachs is working, and it's using all these data sets. It all brings it full circle and makes it easier for a company that was trying to be a data company or a technology company to become a technology or data company.
Can you talk for a second just about security in that context of sharing models?
Yeah, so the security model, I should drive back a second. So it goes all the way back to our Unity catalog. In our case, the way that we think about it is if you make a model in Databricks, the security follows all the way through. And that's how it's going to be. I'm not sure. We're in progress of building that last part in the SQL query. So I don't know if it's going to be a grant where you do just a SQL grant, but it will definitely be group-based, where from your main IDP where you get, whether you use Active Directory or whatever you use, there'll be groups that'll come all the way down to the platform, and you'll be able to decide who can use that model. And then we built in a lot of versioning into all of the things we do. So you'll be able to do challenger models and things like, hey, I want to compare last month's model for revenue prediction to this month's model for prediction, and I want to choose the best fit model, and I want to promote that one. So it allows the business to even be part of the decision process of a model.
To use your example, though, if I've got a journal of prices or something, let's say it's securities, and you've got people who are credit analysts, and you got people who are equities analysts, and you don't want them to see each other's data, but it's one big journal. Can they use the same model, look at the data, and can you select out the
Yes.
things you don't need?
In our platform, yes, because of the way that we're thinking about data security. So you can do column level and row level security. And then, again, I'm going specific to Databricks again for a second. It's features that you should think about. And then we're also building a back-end by the end of the year where you can just tag a piece of data and it'll flow through, and then you make rules based on tags. And rules based on tags are a lot easier than actually doing all these different grants and revokes and data masking and all this other thing. So all of that will be inherent in this catalog. And it should be things that are either there today or tomorrow in the catalog that you decide for your lake house. So does that help? Yep. Yeah, we should. Okay, so I was on SQL. And I think another thing is this is a little bit more about innovation for folks who didn't get to see our this is more Databricks specific for a second, but weren't able to see our Data and AI Summit. I actually joined Databricks in 2018, and you think about all of these things that we built from 2018 forward are to get here, and the way that we got here was listening to you guys, and it's not this whole Lakehouse pattern emerged. It is kind of gimmicky, right? When you say Lakehouse, right? Because it combines some things, but it really did emerge out of reality, and these features that you see emerged out of reality. And you'll see that some of these things, like I talked about, especially from 2021 to 2022, live tables are about making data factories faster. Unity Catalog is about governance, across clouds, simplification of data movement, auditing, all the things that you need to actually build a data program. And then, we're working on things like serverless for cost reduction. Like we need serverless across our entire platform so customers can run something that's very fast and costs very little. They don't want to be managing longer running compute at all. It goes back to when you step into the cloud, compute's expensive. You want to manage that. We built everything from, cluster policies where you can say, hey, this group can create compute, this group can't. This group can create a single node. This ML ops engineer can use 20 nodes or 100 nodes of compute. Those are all, again, things that you think about as step 2 in the cloud. You talk about the curation, you talk about all those things, and there's an optimization step that every customer goes into. We try to not make that happen. We try our hardest to get them to skip that optimization step where they're like, I'm spending too much. We try to teach them as they go into the cloud how to manage based off of the people that are going to use their data and their compute to manage that. But if you skip over that, we often sometimes call that a center of excellence. We want to build a center of excellence with our most important and biggest customers because they spend the most. And we spend the time documenting these things like, hey, but that whole optimization phase should not be ignored, and if you haven't done it, shouldn't be skipped, because what will happen is you'll hear words like, hey, this is too expensive. What are we doing? People start stutter stepping, into the cloud, and then a lot of this stuff gets halted. So, make those decisions that we talked about. Always optimize, always question as you go. Put optimization as a part of your process. Don't make it an optional thing for people to actually spend time thinking about optimization. And then, like I said, and then finally, it makes it easier for you to build that use case machine when you do that. So if you do all the right steps, you put optimization into your factory of use cases. Let's say as you start getting use cases coming in, once you get that foundation built, is make sure that those teams that are bringing use cases on follow your optimization path. And don't let them, and make that living too. Lessons learned fall into that path. Like, hey, we learned that if you do this and you use this, and for example, in this instance type, it saves company X 20%. And I think that these things are I'm trying to tell you the cloud's missteps that people make when they do these things. But again, there's just been a lot of innovation. But the more important thing, the only reason I show this slide is to show you that, and to think about that all this has been customer driven from our inception. And this is where I talked to you guys a little bit about this in the beginning. This is a little bit about total cost of ownership. And some people like these slides, some people like benchmarks, some people don't. I'm kind of more in the camp where I like to do benchmarks with the customer and can actually help them achieve optimization. But what we did as a company, because we believe in Lakehouse so much and all the stuff that we've just talked about, is that we compared what it's like as if you use an engineered system in the cloud, like a cloud data warehouse, to try to act like a Lakehouse, like reading data directly off of object store. So let's say that you try to use I'll give you an example. Let's say you have all this raw data coming in from a sensor or registers, let's use those two, and it's going into a folder on S3 or ADLS. When you try to read it with platforms that don't think about this, it gets very expensive. And that's where they start to push you into, curating in their storage format, which does lower the cost, right? Because it performs better. But what it does do, then what happens is it locks you into a path where you have to use that vendor. And that goes back to that whole curation conversation that we had. If you do this wrong and you jump into that, then you're going to be optimizing out of it at some point. Every platform should be used to its best abilities. And I think that this is one of those slides where the numbers are a little bit sensational, but the idea of what we talked about with curation being important that's why. Hey, we're curating data. All these people need to interact with this data. We don't ever want to be locked into having to use one platform to do it. And that's what this benchmark's about here. And I'll pause any questions on this. And just so you know, it was all done in open formats. In this case, it was all Parquet with all these other clouds.
Comparing 5 different.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sure I don't even know who all of them are, but I know I have an idea. But it doesn't really matter because you could run this with your pricing and get a little bit better, or your use case get a little bit better. It's more about the generalization of it. Okay, and then this is another deeper for total cost of ownership, and I won't spend too much time on this. This is doing TPC-DS with the loading of the data and everything. And again, this is if you use Databricks, in this case as a warehouse, you'll see compared to some other warehouses, there's a lot of cost reduction because you're curating the data on the platform. And we're reading it off of open formats. And that's, again, if you choose to use Databricks and choose to use us for the serving layer, if you will, the warehouse side, you do this. But what's nice about it, if you curate open, you don't have to use Databricks to you can let us win that business from you, or any other vendor win the best price performance for you, reading data in your curated zone. And that's all you should do is pick the best that works for you. But still goes back to what I'm going to drill in today is that your decision on curation matters the most. You can push highly aggregated sets to a different platform if that's better for your business, but start there because you can change always. It gives you optionality that you would have never had before. If you jump over that curation and you publish directly into an engineered platform that has proprietary formats, they can be great and really cost efficient in some cases. You can't pull that back easily. And that's really what I want to show here. The numbers, like I said, they can be a little bit sensational, but it's more about having optionality. And that's why that curation decision that we talked about earlier is so important. Again, this is us showing that we're kind of awesome, I guess. I love Databricks. I work there, of course, but I find these to be, I'd like to do these with customers. But it kind of speaks to how much we've invested in making a warehouse fast on open storage. That's the story here. And I'm done with benchmarks, so I'll pause for a second. Is there any questions so far? You can challenge me. I have thick skin. Sure.
So if you want to,
I'm going to get you.
the mic.
Caught you.
Thanks. So if you want to build a pipeline, start to finish, including the curation, like in your house architecture slide, right, which was going up, have the catalog built, how much coding do you need to do? And the reason I'm asking is because it's very hard to find developers today.
Yeah.
Very, very hard. And you know, I'm all about banking. And all the banks, they have thousands of IT roles open. They can't fill them, right? So my question to you is, how much automation is there? Can you talk a little bit about the amount of coding that is needed to leverage and get those results?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the last 2 years, Databricks has moved to us, and I'm talking again about Databricks. You asked more of a Databricks specific question. Databricks has moved to a SQL first company. That's where a little bit of our heritage is in Spark, right? Spark's great, it's powerful, but it's not simple sometimes, right? To your point. So the things I talked about, Delta Live Tables, those are all SQL. And it does all, you can write those in SQL or Python, or you can mix both, right? The nice thing about that is if somebody wants to use Python for some part of the business logic, they can. But you can do it all in SQL. Our SQL warehouse can copy data with SQL and read data with SQL. I would say we pretty much have 100% coverage on SQL. When you get into modeling, though, like data science, it's different. Yeah, so if we pull that out, yes, the answer is we agree with you that Spark can be too complex. But you still be able to do Spark. And with Delta Live Tables and even with tools like DBT, which is all SQL, run natively on Databricks. So we like to be challenged there. So we'll help you along, but we like to be challenged on if something's missing in that would make your life easier, let us know. But I feel like when I joined, Databricks 4 years ago was a completely different company than it is today. And that, like I said, I'll get off my Databricks hat for a second and go back to Lakehouse. But that was a great question.
So, a question for you. Every reference architecture, everything we built always has the bronze, silver, gold, or raw, curated, enriched, consume zones. And you've talked a lot about choose your curation pattern. If I'm building in or on Databricks or with Databricks, do I not do those concepts of zones, or am I doing it on or with Databricks?
Yeah, you can do it with Databricks, and we support that. So even with everything that we do, we talk and think that way as a company. But sometimes those words are different for different customers, a different nomenclature, right? But we do think that way. We think about curation that way. And even that Live Tables tool that I showed, where it builds a graph of your pipeline, you can tag the curation level inside and report at the curation level. So we as a company think about that. And in the case, let's say that the case you chose Databricks to build your Lakehouse, you can curate everything with Databricks on object store, whether it's ADLS or S3 or GCS.
So it's not that you're not doing it, it's that you're doing it in Databricks, which makes it more portable?
Well, your compute is running in Databricks, but your data is always residing in your object store, and you can go in and read it. Like, for example, if you use any format, Databricks can generally read it, like an image we can read, right? But if you put it down in your object store, you could have Azure ML or SageMaker read it directly off of storage without turning Databricks on. You won't even need to turn us on. And that's why I keep harping on open curation, because you can use a different tool and read it. Whereas if you did the same thing, these warehouses will support complex data types really well. They'll do it, but you have to turn their compute on to read it. And that's where you get into double compute cost. And I was working with the chief data officer of a major telco, one of the biggest in the world. And he was leaning towards curating in his warehouse, in a warehouse. And we became we built a rapport, and I said, you know what, how important is modeling going to be to this company? And they're like, it's hugely important. It's like one of the most important things. I said, well, let's train a model because he's like, we're going to use Databricks for our notebooks. He made that decision. Okay, well, let's train a model. If you curate in your warehouse, let's train a model from the warehouse, and we'll compare performance and cost. It was 4 times faster, and it was less than half the cost because he didn't have to have that compute running when he put it in a zone like that. So there's huge cost implications to it. The cost implication is one, and then the optionality is another. I know if I'm a leader, I want optionality. Like, I don't want to be locked in. And that's why I say when I'm talking about this story with you guys, it's about that curation decision is probably the most important decision you'll make as a data leader for your business as you modernize. And all the other decisions, you can make mistakes, and they're not that big of a deal. But if you make this mistake with a bunch of data and you got to move it around again, that's like job-ending stuff, right? So your point, you're absolutely spot on.
Sorry, I don't mean to ask too many questions, but we kind of think the diamond layer. Thank you. We think the top layer of curation, the diamond layer or whatever, is a graph. Do you guys have any plans for graph or any friendly graph?
Yeah, we do. We have a lot of graph. If we go to Databricks, we have a graph partner. But yeah, and you're right. I think that's one of those cases where you publish the graph out of the curation zone, you build the graph, and it serves a very specific case. We do have partners. You can run some graph stuff in Databricks, but it's probably not what you need. I don't know what you're looking at, but we can.
Neo4j
It's a great decision. And we have a very strong relationship. Databricks does, and also they likely prefer the curation like we talked about also the same way.
Yeah, and I have a question about granularity of this Delta Lake. So can you explain it? Because, our data scientists love Databricks. They love to do it. But I'm from original traditional data warehousing, and I think that methods like Data Vault are good in very granular individual value level historization. But so what's this Delta Lake? How does it handle value level or column level change data capture and things like that?
We do. We have you can actually, out of a Delta Lake table, and we're going to Databricks specific. It's an open source format Delta Lake that we donated to the Linux Foundation. But when you make a change, we have a change data feed that comes out of any change you would make to the actual table would come out as a change data feed that you could read in a different platform. And you also have the actual audits and the versions at that level too. So you can do rollbacks and roll forwards and all that stuff in data versioning also. I think that your question is one of those ones we should probably explore deeper together, like in a conversation with the technical. I don't know which customer are you?
I'm actually a consulting company, but we do Databricks stuff
for
many companies.
Yeah, I'll give you my email and we'll discuss back and forth. But definitely, so one of the customers I already mentioned uses the Data Vault pattern.
In Databricks?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and I'll find out more for you. I don't know. I haven't implemented Data Vault on Delta, but it has a lot of versioning features. It has the change data feed. We have indexes and keys now and all that stuff built into it. So it's pretty, again, for us to say house and Lakehouse, we needed to build a lot of those warehousing features into the format. The nice thing though is you can pick up that folder that a Delta Lake table's in and move it to another cloud and just read it, and then it has all of that in the folder. So that's another thing is like when you think of multi-cloud, you can move a Delta or other formats even. You can take it and just move it to another cloud and not do anything to read it and just read it, and it knows everything about its changes, its versions, all the stuff that you would need, and that kind of speaks to the multi-cloud stuff too. Sorry.
We have time for one more question.
So one of your comments was it's all out in S3, and use Amazon as the example. So it's sitting out in S3. I don't need to spin up any compute warehouses or compute engines in order for something like a SageMaker to access. But if I have a security model built in that says, here's what I'm doing, group level access controls, how do I do that without a compute layer?
So that's a good question. So the way that we think about that, again, this is a little bit more of our governance layer, is you can do Databricks managed tables, where we manage the whole under folder structure, and you give us one credential, and then you do grants and revokes, and we read everything through that. If you read it outside and you want us to manage it, and I'm going through this with that large bank, exactly this question, then they need to know that credential, and then you open yourself up. But we can also support individual external locations with different credentials for you and marshal all that inside of our catalog. And then what happens is the data is still on S3, and we're using ARNs to actually read the data. You need to just have that. You just need to be able to have that credentials from SageMaker to read it. And we're eventually likely going to build something so you can read through other vendors through our catalog. We just haven't done that yet. It's not on the priority side for us yet. It will be, but it's just not there yet.
Well, we do have 2 minutes left, so I guess along that line, do you have third-party partners for access control, like some of the folks here, Okera, Amuta, things like that?
Yeah, so Okera, I was talking to Okera earlier. We're working on a partnership with them right now. That's in conversation. Amuta is a partner. Privacera, there's others that I'm not mentioning, but they're all moving. Like, for example, with Calibra, which is more of a cataloging, they're integrating with our catalog, and our catalog is going to send information to Calibra backwards and forwards, right? That's on the catalog side. Elation, yes. I don't know the status of it. They're our partner of ours. I don't know the status on their catalog. We can find out for you on that one. I don't think it is, but we're not sure. I'm positive on the Cleaver side, and I'm positive that we'll eventually have Elation. And I know we're working on Purview, finishing up Purview right now on the Azure side. So we're just doing a lot with the partners for catalogs right now.
I have one add-on, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but GovCloud, IL4, GCC High GovCloud, do you think we're getting there?
Well, so GovCloud's a little bit different on our release schedule, as you know. It's a lot harder for us to release to GovCloud. And I wouldn't even be able to tell you where we're at on some of these features that I've even talked about on GovCloud. But we're working as fast as we can to get into GovCloud. You realize the amount of stuff that we have to do to release into GovCloud versus is insanely different.
We have to do that too.
Yeah. So that's something that the tech team that works with your account should be able to help you with. And if they can't, reach out to me. I'm going to give my email address out at the end of this.
John, thank you so much. Give him my hand.
Thank you.